The bullies had no idea. They just cornered Joaquín Morales, former Army Ranger's son, who could end them all. Joaquín Morales pressed his back against the cold metal of locker 247, watching the sea of unfamiliar faces flood past him in the hallway of Westfield High School. At 17, he stood barely 5'6", with a lean frame that made him look younger than his years. His dark hair fell across his forehead, partially hiding the scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, a reminder of the IED explosion that had changed everything. The other students gave him curious glances, some lingering on the faded military surplus jacket he wore despite the California heat. Just another transfer student, their expressions seemed to say. Another easy target. The morning bell echoed through the corridors, and Joaquín shouldered his worn backpack, navigating toward his first period chemistry class. He'd been at Westfield for exactly 3 days, and already he could feel the familiar weight of being the outsider. Moving from base to base his entire life had taught him the routine. Keep your head down, don't make waves, survive until the next transfer. Except this time was different. This time his father wasn't coming back from deployment. "Watch where you're going, freak," a voice sneered as a shoulder deliberately slammed into his, sending his books scattering across the linoleum floor. Joaquín looked up to see a tall, broad-shouldered boy with bleached hair and a Letterman jacket. The name Derek Matthews was embroidered across the chest. Behind him stood 2 other boys, one stocky with red hair and freckles, the other thin with calculating eyes. Joaquín knelt to gather his scattered notebooks, his movements deliberate and controlled. Don't engage, don't escalate, just get through the day. The mantra his father had taught him echoed in his mind, though for different reasons than Colonel Morales had intended. "I said watch it," Derek repeated, stepping closer. His voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "You deaf or just stupid?" "Sorry," Joaquín muttered, clutching his books to his chest. He could feel the eyes of other students on them, some stopping to watch, others hurrying past with their heads down. Cowards, he thought, though he couldn't blame them. He'd been one of them at every school before this. Derek's friend with the red hair, Tommy, someone had called him, laughed. "Look at him shake, Derek. Kid's terrified." The thin one, who Joaquín would later learn was called Snake, circled around behind him. "Nice jacket, army boy. Daddy buy that for you at the surplus store?" Joaquín's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They had no idea how close to the truth they were, or what that jacket really meant. It had been his father's, worn during 3 tours in Afghanistan before a roadside bomb had ended Colonel Miguel Morales's career and life simultaneously. The jacket still smelled faintly of desert sand and gun oil, a comfort Joaquín wasn't ready to give up. "I asked you a question," Snake pressed, grabbing the sleeve of the jacket. "You some kind of wannabe soldier boy?" If only you knew, Joaquín thought, remembering the countless hours he'd spent training with his father. The hand-to-hand combat sessions that had started as games when he was 8 and evolved into serious instruction by the time he was 14. The weapons training, the tactical awareness, the psychological preparation for combat situations. Colonel Morales had trained his son not just to be a soldier, but to be a survivor. But that was before. Before the funeral with the folded flag, before moving in with his aunt in this suburban California town. Before promising himself he'd try to be normal, to honor his father's memory by building the peaceful life the colonel had fought to protect. "Leave him alone, Derek." The voice came from a girl with short brown hair and kind eyes. Sarah Chen. Joaquín had noticed her in his English class. She was one of the few students who'd smiled at him, though she'd never spoken directly to him. Derek turned his attention to her, his expression shifting to one of mock surprise. "Oh, look who's playing hero. You got a thing for the freak, Sarah?" "He's not bothering anyone," she said, though Joaquín could hear the tremor in her voice. "Just leave him alone." "Or what?" Tommy stepped forward, towering over the petite girl. "You gonna make us?" Joaquín felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was how it always started, innocent people getting hurt because of him. He'd seen it happen before, at other schools, in other towns. The pattern was always the same. "It's fine," he said quietly, looking at Sarah. "I can handle this." Derek laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the lockers. "Handle this? Kid, you can barely handle standing up straight." He shoved Joaquín backward, harder this time. "Why don't you run along to the guidance counselor? Tell them you need to transfer to a school for special kids." The hallway had mostly cleared now, leaving only a handful of students pretending not to watch. Joaquín recognized the look in their eyes, the same mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't happening to them. He'd worn that expression himself, once upon a time. "Walk away," his rational mind urged. "Just walk away like you always do." But as Derek reached for his father's jacket again, something shifted inside Joaquín. Not anger exactly, but a cold, calculating awareness that his father had drilled into him during their training sessions. Assess the threat, identify escape routes, determine if engagement is necessary. "Don't touch the jacket," Joaquín said, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek paused, surprised by the change in tone. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, maybe even caution. But it passed quickly, replaced by his usual arrogant sneer. "What did you just say to me?" Joaquín met his eyes directly for the first time. "I said, don't touch the jacket." The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Tommy and Snake exchanged glances, suddenly unsure. There was something different about the quiet transfer student now, something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. But Derek was too proud, too used to being the alpha, to back down. "You think you're tough now? You think you can tell me what to do?" He grabbed a fistful of the jacket and yanked hard, trying to pull it off Joaquín's shoulders. The fabric tore slightly, and Joaquín heard his father's voice as clearly as if the colonel were standing beside him. "Sometimes, son, the only way to stop a bully is to show them what real strength looks like. But not here. Not yet. Not until he had no other choice." Joaquín allowed Derek to push him again, this time hard enough that he stumbled backward into the lockers. The metal clanged loudly, and he felt the combination lock dig into his spine. Around them, the few remaining students began to disperse, unwilling to get involved or risk becoming targets themselves. "That's what I thought," Derek said, satisfaction clear in his voice. "Just another scared little boy playing dress-up." He turned to his friends. "Come on, guys. We're going to be late for first period." As they walked away, Tommy called over his shoulder, "See you around, army boy. Try not to cry too hard." Joaquín remained pressed against the lockers long after they'd disappeared around the corner. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of holding himself back. He could have ended the confrontation in seconds, could have put Derek on the ground before the bigger boy knew what hit him, could have shown them exactly what 12 years of military training looked like when applied with precision and intent. Instead, he straightened his torn jacket and headed to chemistry class, where he spent the next 50 minutes staring at molecular diagrams and trying to forget the disappointed look in his father's eyes the last time they'd spoken about fighting. The cafeteria at Westfield High was a social ecosystem as complex and unforgiving as any battlefield Joaquín had studied. He sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating the sandwich his aunt had packed while observing the various cliques and hierarchies that governed teenage life. The popular kids held court near the windows, their laughter loud and performative. The athletes clustered around the center tables, their Letterman jackets like uniforms marking their territory. The academic elite huddled over textbooks and calculators, while the artists and theater kids animated their conversations with dramatic gestures. And then there were the predators. Derek Matthews ruled his corner of the cafeteria like a feudal lord, with Tommy and Snake serving as his lieutenants. Joaquín had watched them operate for 3 days now, selecting targets with the casual cruelty of apex predators. A freshman who'd accidentally bumped into Derek's table found his lunch tray accidentally knocked to the floor. A girl who'd refused to give Tommy her homework answers discovered her backpack mysteriously emptied in the hallway. They were systematic, calculated, and completely unopposed by the faculty, who seemed to view teenage cruelty as a natural part of the high school experience. "Mind if I sit here?" Joaquín looked up to find Sarah Chen standing beside his table, holding a lunch tray and wearing a tentative smile. She was prettier than he'd initially noticed, with intelligent dark eyes and an air of quiet confidence that reminded him of some of the female officers he'd met on base. "It's not safe," he said simply. She raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "Sitting with me, it's not safe. They'll target you too." Sarah set her tray down anyway and slid into the seat across from him. "Let me worry about that." For a moment, they ate in comfortable silence. Joaquín found himself relaxing slightly, enjoying the novelty of normal teenage interaction. It had been so long since he'd had a friend, really had one, not just the temporary alliances formed by military kids who knew they'd be moving again soon. "So," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "where did you transfer from?" "Fort Bragg," Joaquín replied automatically, then caught himself. "I mean North Carolina. My dad was stationed there." "Was?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Joaquín set down his sandwich, his appetite suddenly gone. "He died 6 months ago. IED in Afghanistan." Sarah's expression softened immediately. "I'm sorry. That must be incredibly hard." "It is what it is," Joaquín said, falling back on the military stoicism that had been drilled into him since childhood. "My aunt lives here, so I moved in with her. Fresh start and all that." "Is that why you don't fight back?" The question caught him off guard. He looked up to find Sarah studying him with those intelligent eyes, and he realized she'd been watching him more carefully than he'd thought. "What do you mean?" "Derek and his friends. The way they treat you. You just take it, but there's something about you." She paused, searching for the right words. "You don't seem scared. You seem like you're choosing not to fight back. Why?" Joaquín considered his answer carefully. How could he explain that he'd made a promise to his father's memory, that he'd sworn to build a life based on peace rather than violence, that every instinct screamed at him to show Derek exactly what happened when you cornered someone with his training? "Violence doesn't solve anything," he said finally. "My dad taught me that." Sarah nodded slowly, but he could see she wasn't entirely convinced. "Sometimes it's the only language bullies understand." Before Joaquín could respond, a shadow fell across their table. He looked up to see Derek standing behind Sarah, flanked by his usual entourage. The bigger boy's expression was darker than usual, his jaw tight with anger. "Well, well," Derek said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet section of cafeteria. "Looks like the freak found himself a girlfriend." Sarah turned in her seat to face him. "We're just eating lunch, Derek. Leave us alone." "I don't think I was talking to you," Derek replied, his eyes fixed on Joaquín. "I was talking to Army Boy here. Seems like he's been spreading stories about me." Joaquín frowned. "I haven't said anything about you to anyone." "Really? Then why did Principal Morrison call me into his office this morning? Why did he ask me about incidents in the hallway?" Sarah, Joaquín realized, glancing at the girl beside him. She'd reported the confrontation, probably thinking she was helping. The knowledge settled in his stomach like a stone. "I didn't," Sarah began, but Derek cut her off. "Shut up," he snapped, then turned back to Joaquín. "You think you can hide behind the teachers? Think you can get me in trouble and there won't be consequences?" Joaquín stood slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. Around them, conversations had stopped, as other students sensed the brewing confrontation. Even the teachers on lunch duty seemed to have conveniently found other places to be. I didn't report anything, Joaquín said calmly. But if I had, it would have been justified. Derek's face flushed red. Justified? You little... Derek, don't. Sarah stood as well, positioning herself between the two boys. This is stupid. Just walk away. Move, Derek said, his voice low and dangerous. No. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Derek reached out to shove Sarah aside, his hand connecting with her shoulder harder than necessary. She stumbled backward, her hip catching the edge of the table, and Joaquín watched her face contort in pain as she fell. Something cold and deadly settled over Joaquín like a familiar coat. The cafeteria noise faded to a dull roar, and his vision narrowed to focus solely on Derek's sneering face. This was the moment his father had prepared him for, not the moment to fight, but the moment when fighting became inevitable. Assess, plan, execute. Derek was bigger and stronger, but he was also sloppy and overconfident. Tommy was muscle without brains, dangerous in a group, but easily neutralized if isolated. Snake was the smart one, the one who would run if things went badly. But not here. Not in front of half the school. Not when it would only make things worse for Sarah and anyone else who might try to help him in the future. Instead, Joaquín helped Sarah to her feet, his movements gentle and careful. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though he could see tears of pain in her eyes. "I'm fine." Derek laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. How sweet. The freak's got himself a little protector. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Joaquín could hear. "This isn't over, army boy. Not even close." As Derek and his friends walked away, their laughter echoing across the cafeteria, Joaquín felt something fundamental shift inside him. The careful control he'd maintained for months was beginning to crack, and underneath it lay something far more dangerous than Derek Matthews could possibly imagine. Soon, he thought, watching them go. Very soon. The gymnasium at Westfield High smelled of sweat, rubber, and teenage desperation. Joaquín sat on the bleachers during his free period, ostensibly reading but actually observing the basketball team's practice. Coach Williams ran his players through drills with military precision, shouting commands that reminded Joaquín painfully of his father's voice during their training sessions. It had been 2 weeks since the cafeteria incident, and Derek's campaign of harassment had escalated significantly. What had started as occasional shoves and verbal taunts had evolved into a systematic effort to make Joaquín's life miserable. His locker had been broken into twice, his homework assignments had mysteriously disappeared, and he'd found his father's jacket stuffed into a toilet in the boys' bathroom, an act of desecration that had taken every ounce of his self-control to ignore. But it was the targeting of Sarah that had pushed him closest to the edge. Derek had made good on his implied threat, extending his cruelty to anyone who showed Joaquín kindness. Sarah had found her car tires slashed. Her younger brother had been cornered by Tommy and Snake after school. Even teachers who'd tried to help had found themselves facing mysterious complaints and administrative scrutiny. This is what happens when you try to be normal, Joaquín thought bitterly. Innocent people get hurt because you're too much of a coward to do what needs to be done. Morales, the sharp voice cut through his brooding. Joaquín looked up to see Coach Williams approaching, his weathered face set in its usual scowl. "What are you doing in my gym?" "It's a free period," Joaquín replied. "I can sit here." Williams studied him for a moment, taking in the lean frame and the careful way Joaquín held himself. "You play any sports, son?" "No, sir." "Martial arts? Boxing? You move like someone with training." Joaquín's jaw tightened. "No, sir." It wasn't technically a lie. What his father had taught him went far beyond traditional martial arts or boxing. It was combat training designed to kill or incapacitate enemy combatants, not win trophies or impress coaches. Williams nodded slowly, but his eyes remained skeptical. "Well, If you change your mind, we could use someone with your discipline on the wrestling team. After the coach walked away, Joaquín returned to his book, but the words blurred together on the page. He was losing focus, losing the careful emotional control that had kept him out of trouble for months. Every day brought new provocations, new tests of his resolve, and he could feel himself approaching a breaking point. The final bell rang, and students began filing out of the gym. Joaquín gathered his things and headed for the exit, planning to walk home through the back streets to avoid Derek's usual haunts. But as he pushed through the heavy doors leading to the parking lot, he found his path blocked. Derek stood waiting for him, flanked by Tommy and Snake. But this time, they weren't alone. 3 other boys Joaquín didn't recognize had joined them, all wearing the same predatory expressions. "Going somewhere, army boy?" Derek asked, his voice carrying a new edge of confidence. "We need to have a talk." Joaquín glanced around the parking lot, noting the lack of witnesses. Most students had already left, and the few remaining were too far away to intervene. The teachers' parking area was empty, except for a handful of cars belonging to staff members who were probably locked in meetings or grading papers. Perfect ambush positioning, his tactical mind observed. Multiple attackers, isolated location, no witnesses or authority figures. "I don't have anything to say to you," Joaquín said, trying to step around the group. Tommy moved to block his path. "That's too bad, because we've got plenty to say to you." One of the new boys, a stocky kid with a shaved head and gang tattoos on his forearms, cracked his knuckles menacingly. "Derek told us about you, freak, said you've been causing problems." "No problems," Joaquín replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. "Just trying to get through school." "See, that's the thing," Derek said, beginning to circle around behind Joaquín. "You existing here is a problem. You breathing our air is a problem. You talking to our girls is a problem." Snake laughed. "Maybe we should help you find a new school, somewhere more suitable for someone like you." Joaquín felt the familiar calm descend over him as his father's training kicked in. 6 attackers. Derek and Tommy are the primary threats, bigger and stronger. Snake is smart, but physically weak. The 3 unknowns are wild cards, but they're following Derek's lead, which means they'll hesitate if he goes down hard enough. Exit strategies. Parking lot is too open, they'll run me down. Gym doors are locked. Main building is too far. Best option is to neutralize the leaders quickly and create chaos among the followers. But even as his tactical mind catalogued options and strategies, another part of him, the part that sounded like his father, urged restraint. "Violence should be the last resort, son. Once you cross that line, there's no going back." "Look," Joaquín said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I don't want any trouble. If you want me to transfer schools, I'll talk to my aunt about it." Derek's expression shifted to one of surprise, then disappointment. "That's it? That's all you've got? I thought you might actually put up a fight." "I'm not a fighter," Joaquín lied. "No," Derek agreed, stepping closer. "You're just a scared little boy playing dress-up in Daddy's jacket." He reached out and grabbed the collar of the military surplus jacket, his fingers digging into the worn fabric. "Maybe it's time someone taught you what happens to wannabe soldiers in the real world." The jacket tore again, this time more severely. Joaquín heard the fabric rip and felt something inside him snap like an overstretched wire. That's enough. The thought came with crystalline clarity, cutting through months of restraint and self-doubt. His father hadn't died so that bullies could desecrate his memory. He hadn't trained his son to be a victim. "Let go of the jacket," Joaquín said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than Derek's shouting. Derek paused, something in Joaquín's tone triggering an instinctive warning. But pride and momentum carried him forward. "Or what? You'll cry? You'll run to the principal again?" "I'll give you one more chance," Joaquín said, his body shifting almost imperceptibly into a combat stance. "Let go of the jacket and walk away." Tommy laughed nervously. Listen to him, Derek. Kid thinks he's tough now. But Derek wasn't laughing. Something had changed in Joaquín's posture, in the way he held his head, in the cold calculation behind his dark eyes. For the first time in months, Derek felt a flicker of genuine uncertainty. You threatening me? He asked, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Joaquín met his eyes directly. I'm giving you a choice. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, tension crackling between them like electricity. Around them, the other boys shifted nervously, sensing the change in dynamics but not understanding what it meant. Finally, Derek's pride won out over his instincts. Screw this, he snarled, and threw a wild haymaker at Joaquín's head. The punch never landed. Joaquín moved with fluid precision, slipping inside Derek's guard and driving his elbow up into the bigger boy's solar plexus. Derek doubled over, gasping for air, and Joaquín followed up with a knee strike that sent him crashing to the asphalt. Tommy rushed forward with a roar of anger, but Joaquín was already moving. He sidestepped the charge and used Tommy's momentum against him, grabbing his arm and hip-tossing him into the side of a parked car. The impact left a dent in the door and Tommy groaning on the ground. Snake tried to circle around behind him, but Joaquín spun and caught him with a back fist that dropped him instantly. The three unknown attackers hesitated, suddenly realizing they'd picked a fight with someone far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. Run! Joaquín said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority. They ran. Derek struggled to his feet, his face purple with rage and humiliation. Blood trickled from his nose, and his Letterman jacket was torn and dirty. You're dead, he wheezed. You hear me? You're dead. Joaquín walked over to where Derek stood swaying, his movements controlled and purposeful. When he spoke, his voice was calm and conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying than any shout. No, he said, I'm very much alive. And if you ever touch my father's jacket again, if you ever threaten Sarah or her family again, if you ever so much as look at me wrong again, I will show you exactly what 12 years of military training looks like when applied without restraint. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Do you understand me? Derek nodded frantically, all his earlier bravado evaporated. Good. Joaquín straightened his torn jacket and picked up his backpack. Clean yourself up. You're bleeding on the asphalt. As he walked away, leaving Derek and his friends groaning in the parking lot, Joaquín felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the fragile peace of avoidance and submission, but the solid, unshakable peace that came from standing up for yourself and those you cared about. His father would have been proud. The next morning, Joaquín walked through the halls of Westfield High with his head held high for the first time since arriving. Word of the parking lot confrontation had spread with the speed that only high school gossip could achieve, and he could feel the change in how other students looked at him. The mixture of pity and dismissal had been replaced by curiosity and, in some cases, respect. Derek was nowhere to be seen, though Tommy sat in first-period chemistry with a black eye and a sullen expression. Snake had apparently decided to skip school entirely rather than face the humiliation of showing his bruised face. Is it true? Sarah asked, sliding into the seat beside Joaquín during lunch. Did you really fight Derek and his friends? Joaquín considered his answer carefully. I defended myself. 6 against 1 and you won? It wasn't about winning, Joaquín said. It was about making it stop. Sarah studied his face, taking in the calm confidence that had replaced the careful neutrality he'd worn for months. You're different today. I'm the same person I've always been, Joaquín replied. I just stopped pretending to be someone else. Around them, the cafeteria buzzed with whispered conversations and sideways glances. Joaquín could feel the attention, but it no longer made him uncomfortable. He'd spent his entire life being the new kid, the outsider, the one who didn't belong. But for the first time, He felt like he might actually have a place here. Joaquín? A tentative voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see a freshman boy with thick glasses and a nervous expression. I'm Marcus. I just wanted to say thank you. For what? Derek and his friends, they used to pick on me too, every day. But this morning, when Tommy tried to take my lunch money, he just walked away when he saw me. Marcus's voice grew stronger. Word is, you made them back down. So, thank you. As Marcus walked away, Joaquín felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was what his father had fought for, not just freedom in the abstract, but the freedom for kids like Marcus to eat lunch without fear, to walk through school without looking over their shoulders. You realize this isn't over, right? Sarah said quietly. Derek's not the type to just give up. Joaquín nodded. I know, but it doesn't matter anymore. I spent months trying to avoid a fight, and all it did was make things worse for everyone. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show them what real strength looks like. And what does real strength look like? Joaquín thought about his father, about the countless hours of training, about the lessons in discipline and honor and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It looks like standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. It looks like using your power to protect people, not hurt them. And sometimes, he added with a slight smile, it looks like putting a bully on his ass when he won't listen to reason. Sarah laughed, the sound bright and genuine. Your dad would be proud. Yeah, Joaquín said, touching the torn fabric of his father's jacket. I think he would be. The final confrontation came 3 days later, in the same hallway where it had all begun. Joaquín was walking to his last period class when he found Derek waiting for him, flanked by a group of older boys he didn't recognize. These weren't high school students. They were bigger, harder, with the kind of scars and tattoos that spoke of real violence. Thought you were tough, didn't you? Derek said, his voice thick with barely controlled rage. Thought you could embarrass me and just walk away? Joaquín set his backpack down carefully, his movements deliberate and calm. Around them, students began to scatter, sensing the danger in the air. But some remained, forming a loose circle of spectators drawn by the promise of violence. I gave you a choice, Joaquín said simply. You chose poorly. Derek's face twisted with fury. These are my cousins, he said, gesturing to the older boys. They just got out of county lockup, and they don't like people who pick on family. The largest of Derek's cousins stepped forward, his arms covered in prison tattoos, and his eyes holding the flat, dead look of someone who'd done serious time. You the little punk who hurt our boy? Joaquín studied the group with tactical precision. 5 opponents this time, all bigger and more experienced than Derek's usual crew. The leader was dangerous, ex-con muscle with nothing to lose. The others were followers, but they'd fight if their leader did. This is it, he realized. This is where it ends, one way or another. Last chance, Joaquín said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hallway. Walk away now, and nobody gets hurt. The ex-con laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the lockers. Kid's got balls, I'll give him that. Too bad he's about to lose them. Wait! The voice came from behind Joaquín, and he turned to see Principal Morrison approaching with 2 security guards. What's going on here? Derek's expression shifted to one of innocent confusion. Nothing, Mr. Morrison. Just talking to Joaquín about a class project. Morrison's eyes swept over the group, taking in the obvious tension and the way the older boys were positioned for violence. These gentlemen don't look like students to me. They're my cousins, Derek said quickly. They were just leaving. Yes, Morrison said firmly. They were. He turned to the security guards. Please escort these visitors off school property, now. As the older boys were led away, Derek shot Joaquín a look of pure hatred. This isn't over, he hissed under his breath. Yes, Joaquín replied quietly. It is. But Derek wasn't finished. As the hallway began to clear and normal activity resumed, he made one final desperate play for dominance. Moving with surprising speed, he grabbed Joaquín from behind and slammed him face first into the lockers. "You think you're better than me?" Derek snarled, pressing Joaquín's face against the cold metal. "You think you can just show up at my school and make me look weak?" Around them, students stopped and stared, their phones coming out to record what they sensed would be the final chapter of a conflict that had captivated the school for weeks. Joaquín felt the familiar calm descend over him, the tactical awareness that his father had drilled into him through years of training. Derek was behind him, using his weight advantage to pin him against the lockers, but he was also overconfident, sloppy, leaving himself vulnerable to a dozen different counterattacks. "End it," his father's voice whispered in his memory. "End it now, and end it permanently." Joaquín drove his elbow backward into Derek's ribs, feeling them crack under the impact. Derek gasped and loosened his grip, and Joaquín spun around, grabbing the bigger boy's wrist and twisting it in a direction nature never intended. Derek screamed and dropped to his knees, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. "Please," Derek whimpered, all his arrogance and cruelty stripped away by pain and fear. "Please don't break it." Joaquín looked down at the boy who had made his life hell for months, who had threatened innocent people, who had desecrated his father's memory. It would be so easy to apply just a little more pressure, to hear the satisfying snap of bone that would ensure Derek never bothered anyone again. Instead, he released the hold and stepped back. "It's over," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hallway. "All of it. You don't talk to me, you don't look at me, you don't even think about me. And if I hear about you bothering anyone else, anyone at all, I'll finish what we started here today." Derek nodded frantically, cradling his injured wrist against his chest. "It's over. I swear, it's over." Joaquín picked up his backpack and walked away, leaving Derek kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation. As he moved through the crowd of stunned students, he heard the whispers beginning. "Did you see that? He destroyed Derek. I can't believe he just walked away." That's what real strength looks like. At his locker, Joaquín found Sarah waiting for him, her eyes bright with something that might have been admiration. "So," she said as he gathered his books, "what happens now?" Joaquín considered the question seriously. Derek would probably transfer schools rather than face the daily humiliation of his defeat. His friends would find new targets, or more likely, new leaders to follow. The balance of power at Westfield High had shifted permanently, and Joaquín found himself at the center of it, whether he wanted to be or not. "Now," he said, closing his locker and shouldering his backpack, "I try to be the person my father raised me to be, someone who protects people instead of hurting them, someone who uses strength to build things up instead of tearing them down. And if someone else tries to push you around?" Joaquín smiled, the expression transforming his face from merely handsome to genuinely striking. "Then they'll learn the same lesson Derek just learned. Some people you don't mess with." As they walked down the hallway together, Joaquín felt the weight of his father's jacket settle comfortably around his shoulders. It no longer felt like a burden or a target. It felt like armor, like a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. Behind them, Derek was helped to his feet by a teacher, his face pale with pain and humiliation. He would recover from his physical injuries, but his reign of terror at Westfield High was over. Word would spread, as it always did in high school, and by tomorrow everyone would know that the quiet transfer student with the military surplus jacket was not someone to be trifled with. But more importantly, they would know that he was someone who stood up for others, who used his strength to protect rather than intimidate. In the weeks that followed, Joaquín would find himself approached by other students who had been victims of bullying, seeking advice, or simply the comfort of knowing someone understood their struggle. He would help them as his father would have wanted. He would teach them that strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. And sometimes, late at night when he was alone with his thoughts, Joaquín would touch the torn fabric of his father's jacket and whisper a promise to the memory of Colonel Miguel Morales that his son would honor his sacrifice by building the kind